Thank you for joining us. Today we have our second candidate coming in for the grain marketing risk management position we have open. As a reminder, this is a teaching research position, and we have Heidi Schweizer here from UC Davis. She'll be presenting some of her dissertation research with us today. If you would like to meet with Heidi and spend more time with her, I know she would enjoy that and appreciate that, so you're welcome to add on to one of the faculty sessions that we have left today or tomorrow, so we'd appreciate that. You'll also be receiving a survey tomorrow. It should come out about 3 p.m. Asking you to provide feedback and comments on Heidi, so the search committee would greatly appreciate you taking the time to fill that out as well. So without further ado, please help me welcome Heidi.
Well, thanks for having me here. I study commodities markets and agricultural transportation, and this project is part of my dissertation about the unintended consequences of changes in infrastructure and agricultural policy. So that's my larger research agenda in general. And the Panama Canal is a big change in transportation infrastructure, and so I'm looking at what that means for soybean flows from the U.S. So this, the Panama Canal expansion, it's a really expensive infrastructure project, and they just finished it last June, and it's essentially they added a whole new channel to the Panama Canal, and so now, in addition to being a new channel, the new channel can accommodate bigger ships. So this doesn't really apply to dry bulk, but it's easier to visualize the difference between 5,000 20-foot equivalents. So a tractor trailer is usually 2, so that would be a 40-foot equivalent, versus almost 15,000 containers. So this channel, I think it will take maybe 5 or 20 years to really take advantage of this Panama Canal expansion, and one reason why is because even though it's already getting a lot of use, there's dredging along the Mississippi River and along the Gulf, so that ports can actually accommodate these bigger ships. So to fully realize those benefits will take some time. But that said, the Panama Canal expansion has already been a big deal. So this is a picture I took, and see, like, this is a 40-foot equivalent, and then down here there's these 20-foot equivalents. So this ship fits about 5,000 of these little 20-foot equivalents. And for comparison, here's a dry bulk vessel. And then also notice the technology. They have these little trains to pull the boats into the channel. So then I also went to see the new locks, and here's a 40-foot equivalent. So you can, your eyes aren't deceiving you. This ship really is a lot bigger, and it really can carry a lot more cargo. And then they don't use the little trains, they use tugboats in the new system. So it's a completely different system that can accommodate much bigger ships. And so the research questions I try to think about are, will the Panama Canal divert soybean shipments from the Pacific Northwest towards the Gulf of Mexico? And I focus on North Dakota, and I'll explain why in a couple slides. And then in terms of how much, because most soybeans in North Dakota are typically So Asia is the most important market, and right now most soybeans are exported through Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, that area. So is there any amount that will be diverted towards the Gulf in a region that's kind of along the economic divide? And then what quantity can we expect to be diverted? And then what time of year will the diversions occur? So this particular question, I think, is where the kind of research topics that I really like to think about, because in terms of the freight research, there's not this big focus on seasonality, but in agriculture, the seasonality of these shipments is pretty important, and so that's something that I think I contribute to a bit. So there is some literature, and most of it's about container shipping. So if we think about container shipping, where the Panama Canal expansion is important is a lot of containers come from Asia and they come to the US, and then most of the time they're unloaded in Long Beach, California. They're put on a train and then put on a train to the East Coast. So now that there's this bigger channel, they expect a lot more of those containers to go directly to the East Coast through the Panama Canal. So I'm doing a kind of similar project, except things are going from the US to Asia, so backwards. And then in terms of agricultural trade, there's a couple papers, actually I like these papers a lot, but they take a more global trade view of things, and it's not really, and I really want to look at what happens inside the United States, what happens interior transportation patterns, and what communities is this really going to affect, and those kinds of questions. And also, these two papers, they don't talk about the seasonality really at all. So the literature that's not just about the Panama Canal expansion, but it's about grain and oilseed markets, is pretty related. You can think about what happens if there's a catastrophic event on the Mississippi River. So that's kind of the opposite of building a new big channel. That's taking a new channel out. So, and then there are some more. There's some literature that looks at these spatial arbitrage opportunities, marketing opportunities, and so that's helpful literature as well. My contributions are, I think about things from an economic geography perspective. So geography is about how people interact with space. So I think about how these flows of commodities change over space as other things change. And then I set up a positive mathematical programming transportation model, and I haven't found any positive mathematical programming in the transportation literature. So I think that's kind of a new application of positive mathematical programming. And also I end up, because I need to simulate things, which I'll explain why later, I end up doing this kind of slightly different simulation procedure than before. And like I mentioned earlier, the things that I think I can really say something about is the timing. So sure, if prices are higher in the Gulf of Mexico because it's cheaper to ship through the Panama Canal than previously, then we certainly expect that some commodities will be diverted that may have otherwise gone to Portland. And so that's not really exciting. What's exciting is when does that happen and where. So I focus on North Dakota, and the main reason is it's on this economic divide. I have some data. So North Dakota is unique in that there's actual data on grain and oilseed flows. So the data show that every year most corn and soybeans are exported through the Pacific Northwest. But there are soybeans that go elsewhere. And I know that they're not consumed within North Dakota because there's pretty much no soybean processing. So that's another reason I look at soybeans. And so in terms of U.S. states, North Dakota isn't necessarily the biggest producer of soybeans, but they are the largest net exporter in the sense that nearly all the soybeans they grow, they export, but they're not quite a big enough producer that I would say that they influence the price, the national price. So I kind of use these facts to justify a partial equilibrium approach and to set up a partial equilibrium model. I use this positive mathematical programming approach to set up a partial equilibrium model for a couple of reasons, and one is because it will take many years, maybe even a couple of decades, for the full benefits of the Panama Canal expansion to be realized. So there's not data on that because it hasn't happened yet. And then also, I do have some data on North Dakota soybean flows. It's pretty limited data, but I can certainly still use it, and I can use it to really explicitly talk about the transportation network. And the positive mathematical programming lets me set up this model where I can perfectly calibrate the model to the historical flows that I do have. And I'll try to explain it. You don't have to know what that is for this talk. And the benefits of this kind of model is I use the information I get from these transportation system constraints, and I use that essentially to approximate costs, and I can get I can adjust for the Panama Canal expansion and get a smooth response, which is more reasonable than the kind of jumpy response you might get from a linear program. I have a picture, and I hope you guys appreciate the clip art. I don't really know how else to do it, and I think it's pretty, there's a lot of math, but actually I think it's really intuitive in some ways. So soybeans are produced in North Dakota, and then in particular they're really only produced in these regions right here. And like I said earlier, pretty much all soybeans that are grown in North Dakota, they leave North Dakota. And so within North Dakota, I said, well, you know, they're grown there, and maybe you truck from District 9 to District 6, but if soybeans end up leaving North Dakota, it's not actually on these inland waterways. So the only way soybeans really leave North Dakota are by train. And most soybeans go to the Pacific Northwest. Some soybeans go to Minnesota and Wisconsin, and this is just a feature of the data that there's this region called the Midland category, which encompasses all these states, and I just had to pick the most likely destination, which I said was Kansas City. But really, no North Dakota soybeans go there. So we're really just thinking about what, most soybeans go to Portland, some soybeans go to Minneapolis. Now that there's the Panama Canal expansion, is there going to be more soybeans going to Minneapolis? And so, I have some information. I know the prices of soybeans in each location, and I have separate prices for each one of these districts. And then I have a good idea about the transportation costs. And then basically it's pretty simple. It's just, where it just maximizes industry surplus. So where is it most profitable to ship North Dakota soybeans? And that's to Portland. So, so this shows what I was talking about earlier. So this model that I'm going to set up, it's really what I'm going to do is I'm going to just assume that savings from the Panama Canal are passed through. So I'm going to say, well, if the ocean shipping costs are lowered by 35 cents, then that's going to affect prices in Kansas City and Minneapolis. And how does that change? These percentages? So it's not really fancy in that respect. It's pretty straightforward. So I have things that my model solves for. So I have rail flows. I want to know. How many soybeans go from this district to Portland. I want to know how many soybeans are trucked from maybe this district to this district, and I have that for each month. And then I also try to, since I'm really interested in the seasonal aspect, I have a time dimension in this model. So I'm looking at monthly soybean flows from North Dakota to elsewhere. And they're harvested usually in September. And I know from the data that soybeans are shipped throughout the year. So I have this storage that I have in my model, and that's what I use in my equation of motion, so I can have this time dimension. So the data I have, some of it is very good and some of it isn't. And I think one thing I've been learning from my experience on this project is really what can I learn from very limited data. So there's pretty good information on soybean prices. There's okay information on rail and truck shipping costs. There isn't great information on soybean storage costs. And there's good information on production. But the information that I really need to make this model realistic is the historical information on soybean flows. And what I have is I know from all of North Dakota how many soybean flows are shipped each month. And then I also know for an entire crop year, which is different than a marketing year, which has been challenging for me. It's just a feature of the data though. Is I know for a whole year how much go from, let's say, North Dakota District 9 to Portland, or North Dakota District 9 to Minneapolis. What I don't know is how much soybeans are transported from North Dakota District 9 to Minneapolis in a certain month. So I have really aggregate information, but I can still use it. And so this is kind of really complicated, but don't worry, I'll show it to you again in different steps. So I have this shipping flow data, and then I have price information about soybeans, I have shipping price, and then I have production, and I put all of that into a linear programming model. And that linear programming model is going to put out those choice variables I'm interested in. The rail flows, the truck flows, and the storage. And the reason I set up that linear programming model is because then I can get shadow values from the constraints, and I'll show those to you. And I can use those shadow values, and if I put them into a positive mathematical programming model, then I should get the exact same answer, or the exact same solution for these choice variables I'm interested in. So I can replicate the historical soybean flows with my model. But what I'm interested in is not necessarily the historical flows, but more what could possibly happen in 10 to 20 years from now. And so I have 5 years of data, but I end up, I'm interested, I just say, well, you know, a marketing year, 10 to 20 years from now, what would happen? And so I just use average soybean production, which isn't that important because I'm focusing on proportions. And then I use these shadow values that I got from the linear model, and then I use simulated prices and rail costs. And then I use that. So right here is where I account for the Panama Canal expansion. So we'll get to that. Okay, so right now what I'm just going to show you is the linear model, and then how I use that to get the positive mathematical programming model. So it's basically, I just maximize industry surplus. So there's the price in North Dakota. So let's say this is Portland. There's the price in Portland. You subtract the price in North Dakota, and you subtract what it costs you to ship there, and that's your real shipping surplus. And then truck shipping, you can ship within North Dakota. You can ship to different North Dakota districts, and but I know mostly although this isn't featured in the paper, but commodity flow survey data, I know that that typically if it's less than 250 miles, then it might be shipped by truck, but anything longer than that is going to be shipped by rail. So I know that things aren't shipped by rail within North Dakota. And then there's also the storage. And then I have an equation of motion, and then I have non-negativity constraints, and this is the part that will make it positive mathematical programming, or that I'll use in my positive mathematical programming model, is these calibration constraints. And these come from the data I was describing, the aggregate data on soybean flows. So, so like I said, I know I have crop year data. So for a certain crop year, I know how much goes from the crop reporting district in North Dakota to Portland, for example. And then I also know for all of North Dakota how much is shipped each month. And the important thing that I'm going to get when I solve this model is I'm going to pull out these shadow values, and I'm going to use those. So that's why these changed color, because that's the reason I solved the linear model, is because I want those shadow values to help me approximate marginal costs. So I take those shadow values and I put those into a positive mathematical programming model, and I get the same solution with the historical data. But what I'm really interested in is something different. So I took those shadow values. You can see I put them in here, and I made the programming model nonlinear, and that's how I can get these smooth responses to changes in parameters and changes in policy. But everything else is the same, except I've moved those constraints, the information from those constraints into the objective function. So basically, the positive mathematical programming, actually, it's been used a lot by agricultural economists for things like crop choice. So I haven't seen it used for transportation, so I want to kind of interpret that. So these origin and destination flow penalties for a specific crop year, you can kind of think of that as a way to account for congestion. So shipping, if you want to ship soybeans in October, that's a lot different than shipping soybeans in June. And that's not really necessarily directly observable in the data, and so the penalties here approximate that. And then, oh yeah, sorry, that example was for this. And then for the origin and destination flow penalties, if from a specific district, if you want to ship everything from, let's say, crop reporting district 9 to Minneapolis, then there's really, it could cause traffic congestion on the rail line. So there's really these kinds of increasing marginal costs because there's only one rail line, and some things you can move capital around, but not really. It's not that flexible because there's only so many rail lines, and building another rail line would be costly. So normally how positive mathematical programming has been applied has been to account for these types of things. This is consistent with that. But one major critique of positive mathematical programming when it's applied to the crop choice model is that capital isn't necessarily fixed. So you have a piece of land, you can grow wheat, or you can grow soybeans, or you can grow corn, or you have a tractor that you can use for wheat and soybeans. But in the case of my model, you can't necessarily use the same capital for shipping from North Dakota to Portland as you can from North Dakota to Minneapolis. In that sense, you can't just switch rail lines. So in this sense, I think there's a reasonable justification for this increasing marginal costs, and I actually think it works out pretty well from that aspect. But there are a couple obstacles, and so right here I want to be really careful, I guess. I want to be really careful and clear about what I think we can learn from my model and what we can't. So something I don't have is I don't have second order information on route choice. So I can calibrate the model, but then in terms of behavioral response, the magnitude of that behavioral response, I'll present some results, but I don't want you to take too much from that because I don't really have the second order information I need to calibrate that. And the other thing is I have ranges of transportation flows rather than point estimates. And so even though So what I would like to do is I have these 5 years of data and I'm trying to model one marketing year. And maybe from those 5 years of data, even though it's limited data, I could elicit a behavioral response and get some information out of that. But unfortunately, I can't really because I have somewhat wide ranges of these actual transportation flows. So I want to add that caveat, but I think we can still learn some really important information and tell you what that is. So we can learn where regional shipping patterns are likely to change. And then I also think of it as a lower bound on the magnitude of diversion because of how the model's set up. And then also I can say something about the seasonality of shipping. And I think that this is really important concrete information, especially for transportation or policy decision makers. So when I communicated with the extension folks at North Dakota State University, when I was first starting this project, what they told me is that, well, you know, I don't think the Panama Canal expansion will really change much. I think most soybeans will still go to Portland. And I think they're absolutely right. It's just what I'm trying to say is a little bit different in that it will have a big impact in certain regions during certain times of the year, which is really important when you think about transportation because you're worried about peak load capacity. So now we're going to go to my simulation, which I'm going to put into the model of one, the positive mathematical programming model of one marketing year. And there were, it's kind of a challenging simulation, and I ended up simulating prices for 5,000 marketing years, but I simulated soybean prices for each month. So 5,000 marketing years, but I simulated prices for September and transportation costs for September, October, November, December, and it was pretty challenging. It actually took me several months, and I'm really open to suggestions on this, but I think I came up with something that works. And one of the reasons it's challenging is because there's relationships over time and space for these prices and transportation costs. So if I didn't have a very good simulation, then then I could simulate, let's say this was September, I could simulate a price of $10.43 in Portland and the price of $12 in North Dakota, and we know, first of all, that probably wouldn't happen, and if it did happen, that would be a big problem in my model because soybeans would not go from North Dakota to Portland, they would go from Portland to North Dakota, and so I don't really account for, so my model doesn't account for that, and so when I simulate, I want to be careful, and this is like a worst case scenario. So I tried to, so there's the spatial price relationships, and I account for that using a Vine copula, and the copula strategy, it basically allows you to specify the marginal distribution of each price and transportation costs, and the joint distribution allows you to do those things separately. And I use the Vine copula instead of the standard Gaussian copula because it allows for asymmetric price relationships. So I think that the price of soybeans in Portland could be really important for the price of soybeans in North Dakota, but I don't think that the price in North Dakota District 9 has a big influence on the Portland soybean price. So that was why I had to use this kind of, I guess, fancier version than the standard version. and just assume normal relationships between all variables. I didn't want to do that. So then for the time series aspect, there's some literature on how to use copulas to simulate related variables over time. Some of it is in finance, and some of it's actually in hydrology. So that was fun to read those papers. But I'm trying to simulate 9 time series that are related over time, and the previous literature, the most variables they used was, I think, 5. So I ran into some problems using the standard method. So I made so they have a separability assumption in this literature, which is that you can separate the spatial relationship from the time series relationships. And I couldn't really do that because I didn't quite have enough data to use that method. So I had to make a slightly different assumption, which is a cross-sectional relationships hold and the time series relationships for one value hold. And I chose Portland soybean prices because those are near the root node of the fine copula. Then I say, well, the time series relationships for all simulated values hold. And I'll show you my results here because I want to convince you that it's a somewhat reasonable simulation. So I asked, well, how often is the soybean price in a transshipment region below the price in North Dakota? And so that's kind of the worst case scenario I showed you in the graphic. And in the original data, it happens not very much at all. And then in my simulated data, it does happen sometimes. In Portland, pretty much never. In Kansas City, a little bit. And in Minneapolis, it's almost 9%. But I think that's actually pretty good because Minneapolis is about 300 miles from the 2 North Dakota districts. So I would expect those prices to. So it would be very hard to simulate and not have this happen and not put something in that's deterministic. So I think that's pretty reasonable because they're so close. And then for the time series aspect, here's the first differences. So this is the first difference in crop reporting district 3 in the original data, and this is what the first differences look like when you compare crop reporting district 3 and crop reporting district 5. And you can see that they have a similar relationship between these. So I think in my case, it was a reasonable assumption to make that if the time series relationship for Portland prices holds, and the cross-sectional relationships hold, then it will hold for these other pairs of prices as well. So now is the part where I'm finally going to account for the Panama Canal expansion. We're going to go back to that. And so basically, if we think about this as the market in Asia for US soybeans, then you're going to ship some quantity from the Gulf, and you're going to ship some quantity from the Pacific Northwest, depending on what's cheaper. And so this would be the supply curve of US soybeans in Asia. And if we ship from the Gulf, or if the Panama Canal lowers ocean shipping costs from the Gulf, and that's not controversial, there's lots of discussion on how much, but let's just say 25 cents, then all of a sudden the amount shipped from the Gulf is going to lower this curve, and there'll be higher demand for soybeans from the Gulf. So what I do is I say, well, that higher demand for soybeans from the Gulf, assuming that those savings are passed through, is going to translate to higher prices in Kansas City and Minneapolis. And I want to be careful here too, because I don't necessarily, I just assume perfect pass-through, and I don't necessarily argue that that's realistic, but I think that this research is a starting point for future research on that kind of stuff. And so, so that's what I assume in this paper. So what I find is if there's a 2% increase in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Kansas City prices, then before the Panama Canal expansion, pretty much all soybeans go to Portland. After the Panama Canal expansion, pretty much all soybeans go to Portland, but a little bit less. So I think that's exactly in line with what the extension people at North Dakota State were saying. So I agree. And then, where do those soybeans go? So there's fewer soybeans going to Portland. Where do the soybeans come from? Well, they come from those shipments to Minneapolis. And before and after the Panama Canal expansion, pretty much no soybeans go to Kansas City. So the model's consistent in that respect. But what I'm really interested in is kind of where that will occur. So here's the map of North Dakota. And so crop reporting District 5, pretty much all soybeans from crop reporting District 5 go to Portland. That's when I increase the price in Kansas City and Minneapolis 1%, 2%, 3%, and 4%. Pretty much until you have a huge increase in price, it's never going to be cost effective to ship anywhere else other than Portland. But right here in crop reporting District 9, that's where all the action is. So that's one of the things I think this model can tell us is that right here it's going to affect this region. The Panama Canal expansion will change commodity shipping flows from this corner of North Dakota. So what I do is then because my model has this time dimension, I want to try to learn something from that, and I know that the upper Mississippi is closed during winter, and there's also freezing that may or may not get worse with climate variability. And so I did a thought experiment, and I said, what if there's no increase in price due to the Panama Canal expansion in the winter months, because once it gets to Minneapolis, and they can't get on a barge down to the Gulf. And when that happens, so this is just crop reporting District 9. This is what the pattern looks like normally. So normally there's shipments September, October, November, December, January, and some February. But if there's only benefits to the Panama Canal expansion in non-winter months, then the magnitude of shipments is slightly less, and the shipments are kind of pushed towards the first couple months of the marketing year. So that has certain implications for shipments from North Dakota District 9 during certain months.
So, this is perfect foresight of a freeze in December? Is that, so if I know in September that it's going to freeze in December, is that what this is showing?
No, so this is like, I think of this as kind of a bounding scenario. Well, I guess you can think of it that way. Yeah, but I don't account, so in my model, it's more, I guess you could say, set up as a central planner. So I could put uncertainty into it, but I'm not sure if I will, depending on, but yeah, so there's perfect foresight in the before and after. This is just saying, what if there's no benefits to the Panama Canal expansion when you can't ship out of you can't ship along the Mississippi. There could be some benefits even when you can't ship to the Mississippi, because then you can do staging. Like you could send soybeans from North Dakota to Minneapolis, get it all ready for when the river unfreezes, and then as soon as the river unfreezes, then put it on a barge and ship it out. So that could be a possibility. So basically, when Minneapolis and Kansas City prices increase by about 25 cents a bushel relative to Portland, so Portland prices stay exactly the same, then fewer soybeans are exported through Portland, which is what we would expect. And the magnitude that I get, although I kind of think of it as a lower bound, is that so more than 2 million bushels, which is about 5 unit trains, will be diverted towards the Mississippi. And so that's about the amount to fill one Panama Max vessel. So that's not necessarily a big change, but it's a big change for one region. And the Mississippi River freezing would lower the amount of that diversion by about 10%. So I guess what I will say is that I think with this kind of transportation model, we can get a more nuanced understanding of how the Panama Canal expansion will affect flows of agricultural commodities. And that kind of information is important when it comes to building or maintaining new infrastructure. So a topic that's in the news a lot is how much or how long people have to wait at locks along the Mississippi River, because they're old, and then should they be rehabbed, should they not, because it's expensive. That's certainly a discussion that this literature could be informative for. And then also, as there are these other changes in global transportation networks, what does that really mean for the interior of the U.S.? Because North Dakota is pretty interior and landlocked. So I kind of contribute to that, and I think we can learn something particularly about peak load times, because we know that the region we should be focusing on is that lower corner of North Dakota, and we know when. And there's some more work I want to do, so I want to think a bit more. I want to do some sensitivity analysis when it comes to storage and the structure of storage costs, because the time dimension is one of the contributions of this model. So I want to think about not just a flat storage cost, but some term rate of storage, especially because stocks really, they're really high after harvest, and then there's a lot of shipping out, but then they kind of level out after a while. And so I know you guys know a lot about that, and so if you have any suggestions, I would be happy to hear them. And then I want to I've been thinking about whether or not I can get a better, any type of information on a behavioral response, or more information about the behavioral response to really calibrate or at least bound the second order effects of the model more. And then also, I want to think a little more about the simulation and how I do that. And so, thank you so much. And if you guys have questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
We have about 5 minutes for questions.
So can you go back to their most recent map, I think? Can you just clarify?
This one?
Yeah, so all the action is coming from 9. So can you just clarify what is happening with the infrastructurally that's allowing? Is it just a location thing, or is it location combined with infrastructure of transportation from from 9 to Minneapolis that's driving this?
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to the other map, that might help. But yeah, I think it's both of those things, you're right. I didn't include, so one thing that I spend a lot of time doing is there's websites where you can look at boats going through ports and you can watch them move around, and then also you can get a lot of information from the Department of Transportation about the rail network, so I didn't really include that here. But there's, part of it's just it's closest to Minneapolis, and part of it is also there's these rail lines. There's one that comes like right here, and one that comes right here, and then it kind of splits off and it goes these different directions. So I think it's probably both. But yeah, your intuition's right. Yeah.
So in your model, the prices in North Dakota stay constant, is that right?
Yes.
And so could you incorporate, and so you're assuming you have a perfect pass-through to Minneapolis, but then no pass-through to North Dakota? And so
Yeah,
can you think about how the basis might change?
Oh, yeah. So that's, so that's something, is that it kind of is definitely I want to think about, but because it's on this edge, then if you're going to get it wherever it's cheapest, so it's kind of, if you're in Asia, for example. So I don't necessarily think it would affect prices in North Dakota. But I do think, yeah, the basis and the spatial relationships will change. And then I do think that certainly in 5 to 10 years, prices in all these places will change. But it's more just about their relationships to each other. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Would you be able to incorporate an analysis where you intensify the amount of soybeans being produced in this region and say something about the additional acreage going in one direction versus the other? So 10 years from now, the amount of acres devoted to producing soybeans doubles in these crop reporting districts. Is it just going to split between these two areas with equal proportion as now, or would it change?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So my model can't really account for that. And the reason why is, and part of the reason why is data limitations, but in order to do that, there's also other crops. And so really, I would have to consider, what would happen to corn acreage and what would happen to wheat acreage to really answer that, and I don't include those. The reason I look at North Dakota, I guess, is that, or not I guess, the reason why is because it's kind of this place where things could go either direction, but if you think about Missouri, then in that case, there could be more flows to the Gulf due to the Panama Canal expansion, and that would come from the supply elasticity of those crops. So, but I can't say too much about land use in this framework.
Can you go back to the supply and demand curve? I think I have a related question to Jesse's. You mainly focus on the one app, yes. So you do have a tiny amount of, I guess, the equilibrium point increase from blue to red, right? So that's the sort of overall supply response in terms of the transported grain. So, but I guess that's not too big, but given the amount of your diversion, sure wasn't quite big enough. But I was also wondering the same order.
But this is just an illustration graph. I made a lot of mistakes here. But
But yeah, but it's a, there's a cost reduction, there should be some supply response in terms of overall
Yeah.
how much is going out of North Dakota. And just wondering, I guess it's not too large because even the diversion wasn't that big enough in the hotel, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there will be a supply response. But this is, I guess, more about the direction of flows.
So just a comment, you're gonna talk to the Kansas Wheat guys here this morning, and they might wanna know, can you do this model for wheat? Which is a more complicated market, but can you do that? Can you switch crops and look at that? Is that your economic divide applies for wheat as well?
Yeah, sure, that's a great comment. So I can, the reason I originally was going to do it for corn, soybeans, and wheat, so then I could maybe say something about the land use, and I would have potentially, I could say something about elasticities, because there's more information on that. But for North Dakota, just the quality of the data for wheat and corn isn't very good. So that would probably depend on the data I have.
All right, I think we're out of time now, but there are still times if you would like to sign up to join in on one of the faculty sessions today or tomorrow. So let's thank Heidi first.
Thank you.